Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. I still think about that night in March, 3 years ago now. I was living in the small house on Maple Street then, the one with the blue shutters and the oak tree that scraped against the bedroom window when the wind picked up. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what happened just after 11 o'clock. I remember the time precisely because I'd been watching the digital clock on my nightstand, waiting for it to roll over to 11:15 so I could take my evening medication. I've always been particular about timing, about routine. My wife used to tease me about it before the divorce, how I'd set 3 alarms just to make sure I wouldn't oversleep for work. That night, I was lying in bed with a book about the history of the Great Lakes, something I'd picked up at the library sale. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the occasional car passing on the street outside. The light came from the west, though I didn't see it begin. What I noticed first was the way my bedroom walls started to glow, softly at first, like someone had lit a candle in the next room. I set the book down on my chest and looked toward the window. The light was growing brighter, but it wasn't harsh or sudden. It felt gentle, almost warm, though I know that doesn't make sense. Light doesn't have temperature, not really, but there was something about it that made me think of summer afternoons, of lying in the grass as a child and watching clouds drift across the sky. The glow was white, but not the stark white of fluorescent bulbs or camera flashes. It was softer, more complete somehow, like it contained all colors at once. I got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. The entire neighborhood was bathed in this light, and I could see it moving slowly from west to east, a wide beam that seemed to originate from somewhere high above. It wasn't a spotlight or a searchlight. Those create sharp edges, defined boundaries. This light seemed to blend into the darkness at its edges, fading gradually rather than cutting off. The beam had to be at least 2 blocks wide, maybe 3. I watched it pass over the Morrison house across the street, illuminating their small front garden and the bird bath that Mrs. Morrison had painted bright blue last spring. Everything looked different in that light, more vivid but also somehow distant, as if I were seeing the neighborhood through thick glass. The strangest part was the silence, not just the absence of sound, but something deeper, a quality of quiet that seemed to absorb even the possibility of noise. I couldn't hear the refrigerator humming downstairs, couldn't hear the neighbor's dog that usually barked at passing cars. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had become thicker. I pressed my face against the window glass, trying to see the source of the light, but it extended upward beyond my view, disappearing into the night sky without any visible beginning or end. The light moved slowly, deliberately, taking perhaps 30 seconds to pass completely over my house. As it traveled, I noticed something else, a feeling of being observed, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of attention you might feel if someone were studying you with genuine curiosity. I've tried to explain this sensation to friends over the years, but words always feel inadequate. It was like being seen, really seen, for the first time. Not judged or evaluated, just noticed in a way that felt both intimate and vast. When the light had passed beyond my house, continuing its journey east toward the park and the elementary school, I remained at the window. I could see it illuminating other houses, other streets, moving at the same steady pace. Mrs. Chen from next door was standing in her driveway, still in her bathrobe, looking up at the sky. Mr. Rodriguez from 3 houses down was on his front porch, his phone held up as if he were trying to take a picture. But something told me that photos wouldn't capture what we were seeing. This was the kind of thing that existed only in the moment, only in the experience of witnessing it. I watched until the light disappeared beyond the tree line at the edge of our neighborhood, fading into the distance until the familiar darkness returned. The whole event had lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. Time seemed to have stretched and compressed simultaneously, like a rubber band being pulled and released. I stood there for another few minutes, waiting to see if the light would return, but the night had returned to normal. The refrigerator resumed its humming. The neighbor's dog barked once at something in the distance, and I could hear the soft whisper of wind through the oak tree. It was only when I turned away from the window that I noticed the clock. The red digital numbers on my nightstand read 11:14, the same time it had shown when I first looked up from my book. I stared at it for a long moment, thinking perhaps I had misread it earlier. But no, I remembered clearly. I had been waiting for 11:15, watching the minutes change. I walked downstairs to check the other clocks. The grandfather clock in the living room, which had belonged to my father, showed 11:14. The microwave clock in the kitchen, the clock on the coffee maker, the one built into the stereo system, all of them frozen at 11:14. I went back upstairs and retrieved my phone from the charging cable. It too showed 11:14. I pressed the power button to make sure it was working, and the screen responded normally. I opened the clock app, checked the time zone settings. Everything appeared normal except for the time itself. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone, waiting. After what felt like several minutes, the display suddenly jumped to 11:15, then 11:16, then began counting normally again. I could hear the grandfather clock downstairs chiming the quarter hour, its deep tones echoing through the quiet house. The next morning, I called Mrs. Chen to ask if she had seen anything unusual the night before. She remembered the light, described it in almost the same terms I would have used, but when I asked about her clocks, she seemed confused. She said she hadn't noticed anything strange about the time. I called Mr. Rodriguez, then the Hendersons from across the street, even tracked down the phone number for the young couple who had just moved in at the corner house. Everyone remembered the light, but no one else mentioned their clocks stopping. When I pressed them about it, asked them to check their clocks for any signs of disruption, they politely suggested that maybe I had been mistaken about the time. I spent the following weeks researching online, looking for any reports of similar phenomena. I found plenty of stories about strange lights in the sky, but nothing that matched exactly what I had experienced. There were no news reports about the incident, no mentions on local social media groups, no calls to the police station that I could discover. It was as if the light had passed through our neighborhood without leaving any trace except in our individual memories, and even those seemed to vary in their details. Over time, I began to doubt my own recollection of the stopped clocks. Maybe I had been mistaken about the time. Maybe the stress of the divorce had affected my perception more than I realized. But every few months, usually late at night when the house was quiet, I would find myself checking all the clocks again, making sure they were synchronized, making sure they were still moving forward as they should. And sometimes, in that moment just before sleep, I would remember the feeling of being seen, of being part of something larger and more mysterious than my small life on Maple Street. I moved away from that neighborhood 6 months later, not because of what happened, but because I needed a fresh start. The new house is nice, modern, with digital clocks built into every appliance, but I still keep a wind-up alarm clock on my nightstand, the kind that ticks audibly through the night. It's a comfort, hearing time move forward, second by second, minute by minute, reliable and constant. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed listening to that steady tick, I find myself glancing toward the window, not really expecting to see anything, but watching just the same, because I know now that the world is stranger than we usually allow ourselves to believe, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible finds a way to show itself to us, quietly and without explanation, before moving on into the darkness where we can't follow. I only discovered it by accident, 3 weeks after the fact. I'd been meaning to clear the memory card on my dash cam for months, but you know how these things go. It was one of those tasks that stayed on the mental to-do list without ever quite making it to the top. The camera had been recording in loops, overwriting older footage, but I'd recently upgraded to a larger storage card and hadn't bothered to review what was already there. It was a Saturday morning in November, gray and cold, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, finally getting around to digital housekeeping. I was scrolling through the files, deleting the routine footage of my daily commute, when I noticed something odd about one particular segment. The timestamp showed it was from a Tuesday night in late October, around 2:30 a.m. I remembered that drive. I'd been coming home from my brother's place in Millfield, where we'd been working on his basement renovation project. The work had run late, and I decided to take the back roads rather than the interstate, thinking the quiet route might help me unwind before bed. It was about a 40-minute drive through rural countryside, past farms and woodlands and the occasional cluster of houses. The footage showed exactly what I remembered: empty roads, the twin cones of my headlights carving through the darkness, the dashboard clock counting off the minutes as I drove. But there was something in one particular section that made me pause the playback and rewind. About 15 minutes into the drive, on a straight stretch of road that ran between two cornfields, there was a figure standing in the middle of the asphalt. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal caught in the headlights, but as I watched the footage more carefully, I realized it was unmistakably human, or at least human-shaped. The figure was tall, wearing what appeared to be dark clothing, and it stood perfectly still in the center of the road, facing my approaching vehicle. In the brief moment when my headlights illuminated it fully, I could see that it had the proportions of a person, but there was something about its posture that seemed wrong, too rigid, like a statue rather than a living being. What disturbed me most was that I had no memory of seeing it. The dashcam showed my car approaching the figure, then swerving slightly to the left to avoid it, but I couldn't recall any of this happening. The footage continued for several more seconds, showing the figure receding in the distance as I drove past, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond my taillights. The rest of the drive appeared normal, with no sign that anything unusual had occurred. I rewound the footage and watched it again, more carefully this time. The figure appeared to be wearing a long coat, or cloak, and it stood with its arms at its sides, completely motionless. Even when my headlights hit it directly, it showed no reaction, no attempt to move out of the way, no defensive posture, no apparent awareness of the approaching vehicle. It simply stood there, as if waiting. The quality of the dashcam footage wasn't perfect, but I could make out enough detail to see that whatever it wasn't quite right. Curious and increasingly unsettled, I checked the timestamp more carefully and realized this particular file was much longer than the others. Most of my dashcam segments were about 10 minutes long, but this one ran for nearly 4 hours. I fast-forwarded through the footage, expecting to see the remainder of my drive home, but instead found something that made my hands shake as I reached for the coffee cup. The figure was still there, not just in that one moment when I'd driven past it, but for the entire duration of the recording. I watched, incredulous, as the timestamp advanced through the night and the figure remained motionless in the road, hour after hour. The footage showed the empty asphalt, the dark fields on either side, and always in the center of the frame, that tall, still silhouette. No cars passed, no animals appeared, nothing moved except the occasional drift of what might have been fog or low clouds across the scene. I checked the timestamp again, thinking there might be some kind of glitch in the recording, but the file properties showed it was legitimate, recorded continuously from 2:31 a.m. to 6:47 a.m. 4 hours and 16 minutes of footage, all of it showing the same thing. A figure standing motionless in the middle of a country road, as if it had been there all night and would remain there indefinitely. The strangest part was that I knew I had driven past that spot only once. I had gone straight home after leaving my brother's house, taking the same route I always took, and I'd been in my own bed by 3:15 a.m. I remembered checking the time on my phone as I plugged it in to charge. There was no way my car could have been parked on that road for 4 hours without my knowledge, and yet, somehow, my dashcam had continued recording long after I'd reached home. I spent the rest of the morning going through the footage frame by frame, looking for any sign of movement or change. The figure never shifted position, never turned its head, never gave any indication that it was aware of being observed. It stood with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time and would continue waiting long after the camera stopped recording. The only changes I could detect were subtle variations in the lighting as clouds passed over the moon and the gradual brightening of the sky as dawn approached. As the sun rose in the footage, I expected the figure to become clearer, more defined. Instead, the opposite happened. As the darkness gave way to gray morning light, the figure seemed to fade, becoming less distinct rather than more visible. By the time the timestamp reached 6:47 a.m., it was barely a shadow, a suggestion of presence rather than a solid form. And then, abruptly, the recording ended. I called my brother that afternoon to ask if he remembered anything unusual about the night I'd been at his house. He said everything had seemed normal, that I'd left around 2:15 a.m. as planned, and that he'd gone to bed shortly after I'd driven away. When I asked if he'd heard anything from the direction of the road, any sounds of a car idling or people talking, he said the night had been completely quiet. I drove out to the location that evening, using the dash cam footage to identify the exact spot where the figure had been standing. It was a straight stretch of rural road, unremarkable in every way. The asphalt was old, but in good repair, and the cornfields on either side had been harvested weeks earlier, leaving only stubble and bare earth. There was nothing to indicate that anything unusual had ever happened there. No skid marks, no disturbed ground, no signs of any kind of disturbance. I parked my car and walked around the area, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. The nearest house was at least half a mile away, and the road was the kind that saw maybe a dozen vehicles on a busy day. It wasn't a place where someone would normally stand in the middle of the night, especially not for hours at a time. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, I began to feel uncomfortable, as if I were being watched. The feeling was so strong that I got back in my car and drove home, checking my rearview mirror more often than usual. I've returned to that stretch of road several times since then, always during daylight hours, always finding nothing. I've asked around town, carefully and indirectly, about any local legends or stories connected to that particular area. A few people mentioned that it was part of an old Native American trail, and others recalled that there had been a serious accident there years ago. But no one had heard of anything that might explain a figure standing in the road for hours. The dashcam footage remains on my computer, backed up in 3 different locations. I've shown it to a few people, but their reactions are always the same. Initial interest followed by suggestions that it might be a technical glitch, a double exposure, or some kind of artifact created by the camera's processing software. They point out that dashcams aren't designed to record stationary scenes for extended periods, and that the timestamp could easily be corrupted or manipulated. Their explanations are reasonable, logical, the kinds of things I might have said myself if someone else had shown me the footage. But I know what I saw, and I know what my camera recorded. I've become something of an expert on dashcam technology. In the months since, reading technical manuals and forum discussions, trying to understand if what I captured was even possible. The consensus among experts is that it shouldn't be, that the camera would have stopped recording once the engine was turned off, that the file couldn't have been created without continuous power from the vehicle's electrical system. Yet the footage exists, time-stamped and apparently authentic, showing something that defies every reasonable explanation I can think of. I've had the file analyzed by a computer technician who specializes in video forensics, and he found no evidence of manipulation or corruption. According to every test he could run, the footage is genuine, recorded continuously by my dashcam over the course of that October night. I've installed a new dash cam since then, one with better night vision and more sophisticated recording capabilities. I've driven past that same spot dozens of times at various hours of the day and night, but I've never seen anything unusual. The road remains empty, normal, just another stretch of rural asphalt connecting small towns and farming communities. But I still check the footage regularly, reviewing each file before deleting it, looking for any sign of that tall, still figure. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night on country roads, I find myself slowing down when I see someone standing by the roadside, peering through the windshield to make sure they're real, that they move and breathe and respond to the approach of headlights like living people should. Because I know now that not everything that appears human actually is, and that sometimes the most ordinary places can hold the most extraordinary secrets. And I know that somewhere in the darkness, patient and motionless, there are things that stand and wait for reasons we might never understand, recorded by cameras we never knew were watching, leaving evidence of mysteries that have no solutions. He walked into the bookstore on a Tuesday afternoon in March, during that quiet hour when the lunch crowd had gone back to work and the evening browsers hadn't yet arrived. I was behind the counter, updating inventory on the computer, when I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up to see a man in his 60s, wearing a brown wool coat that looked expensive but well worn, the kind of thing that might have been purchased decades ago and carefully maintained. His hair was silver gray, combed neatly to one side, and he carried himself with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to move slowly but purposefully. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the counter. His voice was cultured, with the kind of clear diction that suggested education and careful speech habits. "I'm looking for Margaret Chen. I believe she works here." I set down my pen and studied his face. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. "I'm Margaret," I said. "Can I help you with something?" He smiled then, a warm expression that transformed his features entirely. "Of course you are. You look exactly the same." He paused, seeming to realize that his comment might sound strange. "I mean, you look very much as I expected you would. I'm David Thornfield. We spoke once, many years ago, in 1986. I felt a small chill run down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I was 23 in 1986, fresh out of college, and working at a different bookstore in Portland, 300 miles from where I now lived. I'd moved to this town only 12 years ago, when my husband got a job at the university, and I'd opened this shop 5 years after that. There was no reason for anyone from my Portland days to find me here, and certainly no reason for them to remember a conversation from nearly 40 years ago. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice polite but firm. "I think you might have me confused with someone else. I didn't live here in 1986. "No, you didn't," he agreed. "You were in Portland then, working at Morrison's Books on Southeast Division. You helped me find a copy of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. It had just been translated into English, and most stores didn't have it yet, but you special ordered it for me." The details were too specific to be a coincidence, but they were also impossible. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle wasn't published in English until 1997, 11 years after the date he was claiming. I remembered the book well. It had been one of the first Murakami novels I'd read, and I'd recommended it to dozens of customers over the years. But in 1986, I'd barely heard of Haruki Murakami. I think your dates might be mixed up, I said carefully. That book wasn't available in English in 1986. David Thornfield reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped through several pages, then held it out for me to see. The page was filled with neat handwriting in blue ink, and at the tops I could clearly see a date, November 15th, 1986. Below that was a list of what appeared to be books, with notes about where he'd found them or planned to look for them. Halfway down the page, I saw my own name written in his careful script. Margaret Chen, Morrison's Books, recommended Murakami. I keep detailed records, he said, closing the notebook and returning it to his pocket. I've been looking for that particular book for a very long time. You were the first person who seemed to know what I was talking about. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. The handwriting in the notebook had looked authentic, aged in the way that ink ages over decades. But the content was impossible. I couldn't have recommended a book that didn't exist yet, and I certainly couldn't have done it in 1986 when I was barely familiar with contemporary Japanese literature. I don't understand, I said. Even if we had met in 1986, why would you remember something like that? Why would you come looking for me now? Because you changed my life, he said simply. That book, when I finally found it, led me to discover an entire world of literature I'd never encountered before. I became a translator myself, specializing in contemporary Japanese fiction. I've spent the last 37 years working on bringing these stories to English-speaking readers, all because of a conversation we had on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November. The specificity of his memory was unsettling. I did remember working on rainy Tuesday afternoons at Morrison's, but they all blended together in my recollection, an endless succession of quiet hours spent shelving books and helping customers find obscure titles. If I had met David Thornfield, if I had somehow recommended a book that wouldn't be published for another decade, I should have remembered something so unusual. I still don't think I'm the person you're looking for, I said. I would remember a conversation like that. Would you? He asked, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes we remember events differently than they actually happened. Sometimes we forget the most important moments entirely. He walked slowly around the store, examining the shelves with the practiced eye of someone who knew books well. In the fiction section, he paused and pulled out a volume I didn't recognize, a slim book with a white cover and Japanese characters on the spine. I was certain it hadn't been there before. I knew every book in my inventory, and I would have noticed something I couldn't identify. Here it is, he said, bringing the book to the counter. This is what I was looking for in 1986. You told me it would be worth the wait. I took the book from his hands and examined it. The cover was elegant but simple, with the title printed in both Japanese and English, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. But this wasn't the edition I knew. The cover design was different, and when I opened it to check the publication information, the page was blank. Not missing, but blank, as if the text had never been printed there. I don't know how this got here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't one of my books, isn't it? David asked. Are you sure? I set the book down on the counter and stepped back from it. The rational part of my mind was insisting that this was some kind of elaborate prank, that someone was playing a trick on me for reasons I couldn't fathom. But the book felt real under my hands, solid and substantial, and there was something about David Thornfield's presence that defied easy explanation. I need to ask you to leave, I said, though the words felt strange in my mouth. I don't know what kind of game this is, but I don't want to be part of it. Of course, he said, reaching for his wallet. But let me pay for the book first. I've been looking for this particular edition for a very long time. I wanted to tell him that the book wasn't for sale, that it shouldn't even exist in my store, but somehow I found myself quoting a price, $24.95, though I had no idea where that number came from. He handed me exact change, including the 95 cents in small coins, as if he'd known precisely what the cost would be. Thank you, Margaret, he said, tucking the book under his arm. I want you to know that our conversation in 1986 was one of the most important moments of my life, even if you don't remember it. Sometimes, the things we do without thinking about them turn out to have consequences we never could have imagined. He walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to me. I hope you don't mind my asking, but do you ever have dreams about books that don't exist yet? Stories that seem familiar, even though you've never read them before? The question hit me like a physical blow. I did have dreams like that, vivid, detailed dreams about novels I'd never heard of, written by authors whose names I couldn't recall upon waking. I'd always assumed they were just the product of an imagination shaped by decades of reading, my sleeping mind recombining familiar elements into new configurations. But now, looking at David Thornfield's expectant face, I wondered if there might be another explanation. Sometimes, I admitted, I thought so, he said. Time isn't as linear as we like to pretend, Margaret. Sometimes information travels backward as well as forward. Sometimes we know things before we're supposed to know them, and we don't realize it until much later. The bell chimed as he opened the door, and cool March air swept into the store. Thank you again, he said, for everything, past, present, and future. After he left, I stood behind the counter for a long time, staring at the empty space where the book had been. I checked my sales records, but there was no entry for the transaction, no record that David Thornfield had ever been in my store. The $24.95 he'd given me was real enough. I could feel the bills and coins in my hand, but according to my computer, I hadn't sold anything all afternoon. I drove to the library that evening and spent 2 hours researching David Thornfield. I found several academic papers published under that name, all dealing with Japanese literature and translation theory. The author's biography mentioned that he was professor emeritus at a university in Oregon and that he had been instrumental in bringing several important contemporary Japanese novels to English-speaking audiences. The photograph showed the same man who had visited my store, though perhaps a few years younger. But I also found his obituary, published in the Portland newspaper 6 months earlier. According to the article, David Thornfield had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, survived by no immediate family. The obituary mentioned his contributions to literary translation and noted that he had been working on a memoir about his career up until the time of his death. I've never been able to explain what happened that Tuesday afternoon. I've told the story to a few close friends, but their reactions are always the same: polite skepticism, followed by gentle suggestions that I might have been working too hard, that the stress of running a small business can play tricks on the mind. They're probably right. It's certainly more likely that I experienced some kind of hallucination than that I was visited by a dead man who remembered a conversation we'd had about a book that didn't exist yet. But I still have the money he gave me, $24.95, that I keep in a separate envelope in my desk drawer. And sometimes, when I'm working alone in the store during the quiet afternoon hours, I find myself looking at the fiction section, half expecting to see that white covered book materializing among the familiar spines. Because I know now that time might not work the way we think it does, that the conversations we have today might echo backward into yesterday, and that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones we don't even realize we're living. The dream came every night for a week before I understood what I was seeing. At first, it seemed like nothing more than fragments of light and shadow, numbers floating in darkness without context or meaning. I would wake with the vague impression of having seen something important, but the details would slip away before I could grasp them, leaving only a residual sense of urgency that followed me through the day like a low-grade fever. It started on a Sunday night in early December. I'd gone to bed around 11, exhausted after spending the weekend helping my parents clean out their garage. Sleep came easily, but it was restless, filled with images that felt more like memories than dreams. I was standing in a vast, empty space that might have been a warehouse or a cathedral, looking up at numbers that hung in the air like glowing smoke. They were huge, maybe 20 feet tall, and they pulsed with a soft blue light that seemed to breathe. As I watched, the numbers changed. 5,847, 293 became 5,847, 292, then 5,847, 291, counting down with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. When I woke Monday morning, I remembered only the feeling of watching something decrease, something that mattered in a way I couldn't explain. But as the week progressed, the dreams became clearer, more detailed, until I could see every digit with perfect clarity. The countdown was precise, methodical, never skipping a beat or pausing in its relentless progression toward zero. And each night, when I reached out to touch the glowing numbers, my hand would pass through them as if they were made of light and air. By Friday, I had started keeping a notebook beside my bed, writing down the numbers as soon as I woke up. The sequence was always the same. I would find myself in that empty space, watching the blue digits count down from wherever they had left off the night before. 847 thou 293 on Sunday, 5,760,431 on Monday, 5,673,569 on Tuesday. The pattern was consistent, exactly 86,862 fewer each night, as if whatever was being counted was diminishing at a rate of 1 per second, 24 hours a day. I began to look forward to the dreams. Strange as that sounds, there was something hypnotic about watching the numbers change, something that felt important, even though I had no idea what they represented. Days remaining until something happened, items in some cosmic inventory, heartbeats left in a life I didn't recognize. The possibilities seemed endless, and each one carried its own weight of anticipation or dread. On Saturday night, something changed. Instead of simply watching the countdown, I found myself able to move through the space, to walk around the enormous digits and examine them from different angles. Up close, I could see that they weren't solid objects, but rather composed of countless tiny points of light, like stars arranged in numerical patterns. And as I moved closer, I began to hear something, a sound so low it was more felt than heard, a thrumming that seemed to emanate from the numbers themselves. The countdown had reached 5,499 through 845, and as I watched, it shifted to 5,499 through 844, then 5,499 through 883, but now I could see something else. Thin lines of light connecting each digit to points somewhere beyond my vision, as if the numbers were part of a vast network that extended far beyond the boundaries of my dream. I reached out again, and this time, instead of passing through the display, my fingers made contact with something that felt like warm glass. The moment I touched the numbers, I was flooded with sensations that weren't quite images and weren't quite thoughts. I saw glimpses of places I'd never been, a city under a red sky, an ocean that reflected no light, a forest where the trees grew downward from a ceiling of earth. And through it all, I heard a voice that might have been my own, counting backward with the same steady rhythm as the display. 5,499,843. 5,499,842. I woke with a gasp, my heart racing and my hands tingling as if I'd touched something electric. The bedside clock showed 3:17 a.m., and my room was dark except for the faint glow of streetlights through the curtains. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was another source of light, a soft blue radiance coming from the wall opposite my bed. At first, I thought it might be the reflection of a neighbor's television or the headlights of a passing car, but the light was steady, unchanging, and it seemed to be coming from within the wall itself. I sat up in bed, blinking hard, certain that I was still dreaming or caught in that strange space between sleep and waking where reality bends and shifts. But the light remained, and as I watched, I began to make out shapes within it, numbers, the same glowing blue digits I'd been seeing in my dreams, but now they were somehow projected onto my bedroom wall, clearly visible in the darkness. 837, they read, and as I stared in disbelief, they changed to 5,499 to 836, then 5,499 to 835. I got out of bed and approached the wall, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The numbers were about 3 feet tall, positioned at eye level, and they pulsed with that same gentle breathing rhythm I remembered from the dreams. I reached out to touch them, half expecting my hand to pass through light and shadow, but instead felt only the cool smoothness of painted drywall. The numbers were there, visible and precise, but they had no physical substance I could detect. I stood there for nearly an hour, watching the countdown progress. Every second, the display decreased by 1. 999 to 835 became 5,099 to 834, became 5,499, 833. Each transition smooth and inevitable. I tried turning on the lights, thinking the numbers might disappear in brighter illumination, but they remained clearly visible, their blue glow competing with the yellow radiance of my bedside lamp. At some point, I must have fallen asleep standing there, because I woke up on Sunday morning slumped against the wall, my neck stiff and my legs cramped. The numbers were gone, the wall showing only its usual off-white paint and the shadows cast by my furniture. But when I checked my notebook, I found an entry I didn't remember writing, scrawled in handwriting that looked like mine but shakier. 5,496 through 221. They're real. The countdown appeared on my wall every night after that, always at 3:17 a.m., always lasting until dawn. I tried photographing it, but my camera showed only blank wall. I tried having friends stay over, but they saw nothing unusual, even when I pointed directly at the glowing digits and described exactly what I was seeing. To everyone else, my wall remained empty, normal, unexceptional, but I could see the numbers clearly, and I began to document their progression obsessively. I calculated that at the current rate, the countdown would reach zero in approximately 63 days. What would happen then? The question consumed my thoughts during the day and filled my dreams with increasingly vivid scenarios. Sometimes I imagined it was counting down to some personal event, my death perhaps, or some fundamental change in my life. Other times, I wondered if it might be connected to something larger, some cosmic event that would affect everyone, but that only I had been chosen to witness. As the days passed, I noticed other changes. I began to see patterns in everyday events that seemed connected to the countdown, license plates that contained sequences from the nightly display, timestamps on emails that matched portions of the decreasing numbers, even prices at the grocery store that echoed the digits I'd watched fade into dawn. The world seemed to be reflecting the countdown back at me, as if reality itself was somehow synchronized with whatever process I was witnessing. I also started having the dreams during the day, brief flashes while I was fully awake, momentary glimpses of that vast empty space and the network of light that connected the numbers to places beyond my understanding. Sometimes, while sitting at my desk at work or standing in line at the bank, I would suddenly find myself looking up at glowing digits that hung in the air for just a second before vanishing. The countdown reached 4 million with 3 weeks remaining, and I realized I had become afraid. Not of the numbers themselves, which had become as familiar as old friends, but of what their disappearance might mean. They had become the organizing principle of my life, the steady rhythm around which everything else revolved. Without them, I wasn't sure who I would be or how I would measure the passing of time. I began to research countdowns, looking for any historical precedent for what I was experiencing. I found stories of people who had prophetic dreams, accounts of mysterious displays that appeared in the sky before significant events, tales of individuals who had been given advance warning of disasters or changes, but nothing that matched the precise mathematical progression I witnessed every night. With 1 week remaining, the countdown reached 604,097, and I made a decision. On the final night, I would stay awake from beginning to end. I would watch the numbers decrease all the way to zero, and I would be ready for whatever happened next. I cleared my schedule, stocked up on coffee, and prepared myself for a vigil that might change everything or nothing. The last night arrived with surprising normalcy. The countdown appeared at 3:17 a.m. as it always did, showing 86 through 399. I settled into the chair I had positioned facing the wall and began the long watch toward zero. The numbers decreased with their usual steadiness: 86 398, 86 397, 86 396. Each second brought me closer to an answer I wasn't sure I wanted to receive. As the countdown entered its final hour, something strange began to happen. The numbers started to brighten, their blue glow intensifying until they cast visible shadows on the opposite wall. and I began to hear that low, thrumming sound again, the same frequency I had encountered in my dreams, growing stronger as the display approached its termination point. At 86, I could feel the sound in my chest, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. At 43, the numbers were so bright I had to squint to look at them directly. At 21, the thrumming had become a harmony, as if multiple voices were counting down together in languages I didn't recognize. 10, 9, 8. The wall began to shimmer as if the air itself was vibrating in sympathy with the countdown. 7, 6, 5. I could see shapes moving beyond the numbers, figures or forms that existed in the space between the digits. 4, 3, 2. At 1, everything stopped. The thrumming ceased, the light faded to its normal intensity, and the number hung there for what felt like minutes rather than seconds. And then, with a gentleness that surprised me, it changed to 0. For a moment, nothing happened. The 0 glowed softly on my wall, complete and final, while I held my breath and waited. Then, gradually, the number began to fade, growing dimmer and more transparent until it was barely visible. And in its place, new numbers began to appear. 10,000,000. Another countdown, longer than the first, beginning its own slow journey towards some distant 0. I laughed then, a sound that was part relief and part recognition. Whatever I had been watching, whatever process I had been privileged to witness, it wasn't ending. It was beginning again, part of a cycle that might continue for decades, or centuries, or forever. I was not observing the countdown to an ending, but to a renewal, a reset, a fresh start in a game whose rules I might never understand. The new numbers continued to appear every night, and I continue to document their progression. I no longer worry about what will happen when they reach 0, because I know now that there will always be another countdown after this one, another chance to watch time move backward towards some moment of transformation or rebirth. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think I understand why I was chosen to see this. Not because I am special or important, but because someone needs to witness these countdowns, to track their progress and remember their patterns. Someone needs to know that time is not only linear, that numbers can count backward as well as forward, and that the end of one thing is always the beginning of another. I discovered it on my third morning at the campsite, while collecting firewood in the stand of white pines about 50 yards from my tent. I'd been coming to this particular spot in the Nicolet National Forest for 8 years, always during the first week of September, when the early autumn light slants through the canopy in cathedral rays, and the nights are cool enough to make a campfire feel necessary rather than merely pleasant. It was my annual retreat from the noise and complications of city life, 5 days of solitude in a place so remote that cell phones were useless, and the nearest road was a 2-mile hike through unmarked forest. The camera was positioned about 12 feet up in an old pine, secured to the trunk with what looked like professional mounting hardware. It was a high-end trail camera, the kind that hunters and wildlife researchers use to monitor game paths and animal behavior. But this one wasn't pointed at a deer trail or a water source. It was aimed directly at my campsite, positioned at the perfect angle to capture my tent, my fire ring, and the small clearing where I spent my days reading and cooking meals on a portable stove. I stood there for several minutes, staring up at the device, trying to process what I was seeing. The camera was clearly not new. The camouflage housing showed signs of weather exposure, and there were small patches of lichen growing on its edges. It had been there for months, possibly years, silently documenting whatever happened in the clearing below. The lens was pointed with such precision that I felt certain it hadn't been placed randomly. Someone had specifically chosen this location, this angle, this particular tree to monitor my campsite. But I had been the only person to camp in this spot for as long as I could remember. The clearing was well off any established trail, accessible only by following a creek bed for half a mile and then bushwhacking through dense underbrush. I had discovered it by accident during my first visit to the area when I'd gotten turned around while hiking and stumbled into what felt like a secret room carved out of the forest. In all my years of returning here, I had never seen signs of other campers. No fire rings, no trampled vegetation, no trash or equipment left behind. I climbed the tree to examine the camera more closely. It was a Reckonix Hyperfire model, expensive equipment that could operate for months on a single set of batteries and capture thousands of high-resolution images. The SD card slot was accessible, but when I tried to remove the memory card, I found it was locked with a small metal tab that had been bent in a way that made removal impossible without proper tools. The camera's LCD screen showed that it was still active, still recording, with a battery level that indicated recent maintenance. The discovery transformed my peaceful retreat into something unsettling. Every movement I made back at the campsite felt observed, documented, preserved in digital memory for purposes I couldn't fathom. I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the tree where the camera watched, hyper-aware of my actions in a way that made simple tasks, like cooking breakfast or reading, feel performative. I tried to convince myself that there might be an innocent explanation. Perhaps a wildlife biologist was conducting a long-term study of the area, and my campsite happened to fall within their research zone. Or maybe the Forest Service had installed monitoring equipment to track illegal camping or environmental damage. But neither explanation felt adequate. Research cameras were usually marked with contact information, and they were positioned to capture animal behavior, not human activity. That evening, I built my fire closer to the tent than usual, creating a barrier of light between myself and the watching camera. But the flames only emphasized how exposed I was, casting dancing shadows that would make perfect subjects for nighttime photography. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the normal sounds of the forest: wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, and wondering how many nights someone had been watching me sleep in the same spot. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised me with its firmness. Instead of packing up and leaving, I decided to stay and try to understand what was happening. I set up my own small digital camera on a tripod, pointing it toward the tree where the trail camera was mounted, hoping to capture anyone who might come to check on their equipment. I also began documenting my own activities with deliberate precision, taking photographs and writing detailed notes about everything I did, creating my own record of my time in the clearing. For 3 days, nothing happened. My camera recorded only the unchanging view of the pine tree in its hidden observer. But on my final night, I was awakened around 2 a.m. by the soft sound of footsteps moving through the forest. not the heavy, crashing progress of a large animal, but the careful, measured steps of someone trying to move quietly through the underbrush. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening as the footsteps circled my campsite at a distance, never coming close enough for me to see who or what was making them. The sound was patient, methodical, as if someone was conducting a thorough reconnaissance of my camp without wanting to disturb me. After perhaps 20 minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into the deeper forest until I could no longer distinguish them from the normal sounds of the night. In the morning, I found fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the creek, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern that suggested hiking boots rather than work boots or casual shoes. The prints led from the direction of the trail camera tree to various vantage points around my campsite, then disappeared on the rocky ground near the water. Someone had indeed been watching me, studying my camp with the same careful attention that the camera had been providing for months or years. I hiked out that day as planned, but the experience haunted me through the autumn and into winter. I researched the property records for the area, trying to determine if the land where I had been camping was actually public forest or private property that I had been inadvertently trespassing on. But according to every map and document I could find, the clearing was well within the boundaries of the Nicollet National Forest, public land where camping was permitted. I also spent hours online searching for any mention of surveillance cameras in national forests or reports of campers being monitored without their knowledge. I found a few scattered accounts. Hikers who had discovered cameras pointed at trails, campers who had felt watched during solo trips, but nothing that suggested a systematic pattern of observation. When September came around again, I almost didn't return to the clearing. The thought of spending another 5 days under the watchful eye of an unknown observer was deeply unsettling. But curiosity eventually overcame caution, and I found myself hiking the familiar route back to my secret campsite, wondering what changes a year might have brought. The trail camera was gone. The mounting hardware remained on the pine tree, but the device itself had been removed, leaving only faded marks on the bark where it had been secured. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that I would no longer be under surveillance, but disappointment that I had lost my chance to solve the mystery of who had been watching me and why. I set up my tent in the same spot and tried to recapture the sense of peaceful solitude that had drawn me to this place for so many years. But the awareness of having been observed had changed something fundamental about the experience. Even with the camera gone, I found myself constantly scanning the surrounding trees, looking for other devices, other signs that my presence was being documented. On the second night, I discovered that the camera hadn't been removed. It had been relocated. I found it mounted on a different tree, higher up and better camouflaged, still pointing toward my campsite, but from a new angle that provided an even clearer view of my activities. The positioning was so skillful that I might never have noticed it if I hadn't been specifically looking for surveillance equipment. This time, I decided to leave a message. I wrote a note on a piece of paper from my journal, asking whoever was monitoring the site to contact me if they had concerns about my presence there. I placed the note in a plastic bag and tied it to the tree directly below the camera, where it would be clearly visible to anyone checking the equipment. When I returned the following year, the note was gone, but no response had been left in its place. The camera had been moved again, this time to a position that was nearly invisible from ground level, integrated so seamlessly into the natural camouflage of the forest that I spent most of a day searching before I located it. The person responsible for this surveillance had clearly been observing my attempts to communicate and had chosen to remain anonymous. I've returned to the clearing 4 more times since then, and the pattern has continued. The camera is always there, always watching, always moved to a new location that demonstrates an intimate knowledge of the site and sophisticated understanding of concealment techniques. I've never again heard footsteps in the night or found fresh boot prints, but I know I'm being observed with the same patient attention that I've received for years. I've stopped trying to solve the mystery. The watcher, whoever they are, has made it clear that they intend to remain anonymous, and their surveillance seems to be conducted with a respect for my safety and privacy that suggests benign intent. Perhaps they're a researcher studying long-term camping patterns, or a landowner who wants to monitor their property without confronting visitors directly. Perhaps there's someone who found my annual pilgrimages interesting enough to document, the way a wildlife photographer might follow the seasonal movements of a particular animal. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and stranger than I've allowed myself to consider. Maybe the forest itself has developed a curiosity about the human who returns each year to sit quietly among the pines, and the camera is simply the means by which something larger and more patient than I can imagine has chosen to study the peculiar behavior of a creature who seeks solitude in places where solitude should be absolute. I still make my annual trip to the clearing, and I still feel the presence of the watching camera somewhere in the trees above. But I've learned to find a strange comfort in the knowledge that someone or something considers my quiet retreat worth documenting. In a world where most of our actions go unnoticed and unremembered, there's something oddly reassuring about being observed with such consistent attention, even if I'll never know who's behind the lens or what they see in the simple act of a person choosing to spend time alone among the trees. I left Chicago at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, planning to drive straight through to my sister's house in Madison. It was a trip I'd made dozens of times over the years, a simple 3-hour journey up Interstate 90 through familiar Wisconsin farmland. I had a full tank of gas, a travel mug of coffee, and a playlist of old songs that would carry me through the afternoon. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, brilliant blue sky, and the kind of golden light that makes even the most mundane landscape look like a painting. I remember merging onto the interstate, checking my mirrors, settling into the right lane behind a semi hauling what looked like farm equipment. The radio was playing something by Tom Petty, and I was thinking about my sister's phone call from the night before, how she'd sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her husband had been laid off 6 months earlier, and they were struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on their small ranch house. I was bringing a check that would help with November's payment, money I could afford to give, but that they desperately needed to receive. The last clear memory I have from that drive is passing the exit for Belvedere, maybe 40 minutes out of Chicago. I glanced at the dashboard clock and saw it was 2:57 p.m., right on schedule. The coffee was still warm, the gas gauge showed 3/4 full, and the traffic was light enough that I could maintain a steady 70 miles per hour. I was listening to an oldies station, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel to a song I'd heard 1,000 times before. The next thing I remember is pulling into my sister's driveway as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple that belonged to early evening rather than mid-afternoon. I parked behind her car and sat for a moment, confused by the light. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was. I looked at my phone to check the time and felt a chill run through me when I saw the display. 6:47 p.m. According to my phone, I had been driving for more than 4 hours, but the trip from Chicago to Madison never took longer than 3, even in heavy traffic. I checked the dashboard clock and found it matched my phone exactly. I tried to remember the last part of the drive, the familiar landmarks, the exit signs, the final turns through Madison's residential streets, but found only a strange blankness, as if someone had carefully erased those hours from my memory. My sister came out to greet me before I could make sense of what had happened. "You made good time," she said, giving me a hug. "I was expecting you around 7. I wanted to tell her that I should have arrived by 5:30 at the latest, that somehow I had lost an hour and a half somewhere between leaving Chicago and reaching her driveway. But the words felt absurd, even as I thought them. Traffic wasn't too bad, I heard myself say, though I had no memory of encountering any traffic at all. We went inside, where she had dinner waiting, pot roast with vegetables, the same meal she'd been making for family gatherings since we were children. As we ate, she asked about my drive, and I found myself giving vague answers about road conditions and weather, avoiding any specifics because I couldn't remember any. After dinner, I excused myself and went out to examine my car more carefully. The odometer showed I had driven 167 miles since leaving Chicago, which was about right for the trip to Madison. But the gas gauge, which had shown 3/4 full when I'd passed Belvedere, now read just over half. I had somehow used more fuel than the distance would suggest, as if I had taken a much longer route or spent time idling somewhere I couldn't recall. I called my sister's phone from my cell, testing whether there might have been some kind of time zone confusion or technical glitch. But both phones showed the same time, synchronized with the network, and Madison was in the same central time zone as Chicago anyway. There was no rational explanation for the missing hours except that I had somehow lost nearly 2 hours of driving time, with no memory of where I had been or what I had done. That night, I lay awake in my sister's guest room, trying to reconstruct the lost portion of my journey. I could remember leaving Chicago clearly, could recall the early part of the drive in perfect detail, but between the Belvedere exit and arriving at my sister's house, there was nothing, not a single landmark, not 1 mile marker, not even the vague impression of having driven through familiar territory. I began to worry that I might have had some kind of medical episode, a seizure or a stroke that had affected my memory while somehow leaving me able to continue driving. But I felt fine physically, and the idea of navigating unfamiliar roads for hours while unconscious or impaired seemed impossible. I would have crashed, gotten lost, or at least attracted the attention of other drivers or police officers. The next morning, I retraced my route home, paying careful attention to every exit and landmark. Everything looked familiar until I reached the Belvedere area, where I had my last clear memory from the previous day. From that point south toward Chicago, the landscape seemed exactly as I remembered it. But the stretch of highway between Belvedere and Madison, which I had driven countless times before, looked somehow different. Not wrong exactly, but subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite identify. I stopped at a rest area near Wisconsin Dells and studied my road atlas, trying to figure out how I might have gotten lost or taken an unintended detour. But there were only so many ways to get from Chicago to Madison, and all of them were clearly marked and well traveled. Even if I had missed an exit or taken a wrong turn, I should have realized my mistake within minutes and corrected course. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking obsessively about those lost hours. I researched highway hypnosis, the phenomenon where drivers can operate their vehicles automatically while their conscious minds are focused elsewhere. But even in the most extreme cases, people retained some awareness of having driven, some sense of time passing and distance covered. What I had experienced was different, a complete absence of memory, as if I had been somewhere else entirely during those missing hours. I started carrying a digital recorder in my car, speaking my location and the time every few minutes during long drives. It felt paranoid, but I was desperate to avoid losing time again. For months, nothing unusual happened. Every trip was documented, every mile accounted for, every moment of driving time preserved in my increasingly extensive audio logs. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, it happened again. I was driving from Milwaukee to my mother's house in Peoria, another route I knew well, when I found myself sitting in her driveway with no memory of the final 2 hours of the trip. My digital recorder showed a gap in the timeline, my voice clearly stating that I was passing through Rockford at 3:20 p.m., then nothing until I arrived at my destination at 6:15 p.m. This time, I was more systematic in my investigation. I checked my credit card statements for any transactions during the missing hours, but found nothing. I called gas stations and restaurants along my supposed route, asking if they remembered serving someone matching my description, but no one did. I even filed a report with the Illinois State Police, asking if there had been any accidents or incidents involving my license plate number, but their records showed nothing. The pattern continued over the next several years, long drives that would inexplicably extend by an hour or two, with no memory of where I had been or what I had done during the missing time. It didn't happen on every trip, but often enough that I began to dread driving anywhere more than 50 miles from home. I consulted doctors, neurologists, sleep specialists, anyone who might be able to explain what was happening to me. The medical tests revealed nothing unusual. My brain scans were normal, my reflexes were fine, and my cognitive function showed no signs of impairment. One neurologist suggested that I might be experiencing a rare form of dissociative disorder, but the episodes were too specific, too connected to driving, to fit any established pattern of psychological dysfunction. I began to research other people who had experienced similar phenomena, searching online forums and medical journals for any mention of lost driving time. I found a few scattered reports, people who had arrived at their destinations hours later than expected with no memory of the extra time, always on routes they had traveled many times before. But these accounts were rare, dismissed by experts as examples of highway hypnosis or simple confusion about timing. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 years ago during a drive from St. Louis to Kansas City. I lost nearly 3 hours that time, arriving well after dark at what should have been an afternoon destination. But when I checked my car's GPS history the next day, I found something that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the data. According to the device, I had driven almost 200 additional miles during those missing hours, following a route that took me through small towns I had never heard of, on roads that didn't appear on any map I could find. I printed out the GPS log and tried to trace the route on paper, but the coordinates led to empty fields and forests, places where roads supposedly didn't exist. When I drove back to investigate, following the GPS coordinates as precisely as possible, I found only farmland and scattered houses, no evidence of the highways and intersections that my car's navigation system insisted I had traveled. I stopped taking long drives after that, limiting myself to local trips that I could complete in an hour or less. I told my family that I had developed anxiety about highway driving, which wasn't entirely untrue, but the real reason was that I could no longer trust my own experience of time and space when I was behind the wheel for extended periods. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I wonder where I go during those lost hours. Am I driving through some parallel version of the familiar landscape, following roads that exist only during certain moments or under specific conditions? Am I experiencing time differently when I'm alone on the highway, moving at speeds that somehow disconnect me from the normal flow of minutes and hours? Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and more disturbing. Maybe those missing hours represent the times when I'm most fully present, most completely myself, and it's the rest of my life that feels like a dream or a half-remembered story. Maybe what I think of as lost time is actually found time, moments when I finally understand something important about the nature of travel and distance and the strange spaces that exist between the places we think we know. I still have my car, though I rarely drive it more than a few miles from home. But sometimes, on clear afternoons, when the light has that particular golden quality that reminds me of autumn drives through the Midwest, I feel the urge to get on the interstate and see what happens. Not to visit family or fulfill any practical purpose, but simply to drive until I lose track of time again, to surrender to whatever process has been calling me, to those unmappable places where hours can disappear like morning fog and the familiar becomes impossible to recall. I was working the night shift at the water treatment plant when I first saw it. This was back in 2019, before everything changed, when I still believed the world operated according to rules I understood. The plant sits on the outskirts of town, surrounded by scrubland and a few scattered farmhouses, and from my position in the control room, I had a clear view of the cell tower about half a mile to the east. It was one of those tall, lattice structures, maybe 300 feet high, with the usual array of equipment mounted near the top and red warning lights that blinked steadily through the night. I'd been monitoring the filtration systems for about 3 hours when I decided to take a break. The coffee was burnt and bitter, the way it always was after midnight, but I needed the caffeine to stay alert. I was standing at the window, looking out at the darkness and sipping from my mug when I noticed something moving on the tower. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance worker, though it would have been unusual for someone to be working at 2 in the morning. I set down my coffee and picked up the binoculars we kept on the windowsill for checking the intake pipes. What I saw through the lenses made me lower the binoculars and rub my eyes. Then I looked again, thinking perhaps fatigue was playing tricks on me, but it was still there, about halfway up the tower, climbing steadily toward the top. The shape was wrong, though. Too long, too fluid in its movements. It wasn't a person in coveralls with safety equipment. It was something else entirely. The thing was perhaps 8 feet long, maybe more, with a body that seemed to flow rather than move in discrete segments. It clung to the metal framework with what looked like multiple appendages, though the distance and darkness made it difficult to count them precisely. The way it moved reminded me of a caterpillar, but scaled up impossibly large, and with a purposefulness that seemed almost intelligent. It climbed smoothly, without hesitation, as if it had done this many times before. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, transfixed by the slow, methodical progress. The creature, I couldn't think of any other word for it, reached the first equipment platform and paused there, seeming to examine the machinery mounted on the tower. It extended what might have been a head or sensory organ toward the metal housing of what I knew was a cellular repeater. For a moment, it remained perfectly still, and I had the strange impression that it was listening to something, or perhaps tasting the air. Then it resumed climbing, moving past the equipment array toward the very top of the tower. The red warning lights continued their steady blinking, casting brief glimpses of the creature's form in crimson flashes. Its surface appeared smooth, almost reflective, and in those moments when the light hit it directly, I could see what looked like segmentation along its length, like joints or natural divisions in its body. But between the flashes, it seemed to blend with the darkness, becoming almost invisible against the night sky. When it reached the top of the tower, it coiled itself around the uppermost section, wrapping its length around the metal framework in a spiral pattern. From my vantage point, it looked like it was embracing the tower, holding it in some kind of intimate contact. It remained in that position for what felt like a long time, though I was too absorbed in watching to check the clock. The normal sounds of the plant, the hum of pumps, the whisper of water through pipes, seemed muted, as if the very air had become thicker. I should have been afraid, I suppose. Any rational person would have been terrified by what I was seeing. But instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, almost meditative. There was something hypnotic about the creature's movements, something that suggested patience and purpose rather than threat. It wasn't aggressive or chaotic. It was simply there, doing whatever it was that it did, following some pattern of behavior that made perfect sense to it, even if I couldn't understand it. Eventually, it began to descend, moving with the same fluid grace it had shown while climbing. I watched it work its way down the tower, past the equipment arrays, past the guy wire attachment points, until it reached the base. There, it seemed to pause again, and for a moment I thought it might be looking in my direction, though the distance was too great for me to be certain. Then it moved away from the tower, across the open ground, and disappeared into the darkness beyond my sight. I stood at the window for another hour, hoping to see it again, but the night had returned to normal. The tower stood silent and then empty, its red lights blinking their steady rhythm, and I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. 12-hour shifts can play tricks on the mind, especially in the small hours when the body's rhythms are at their lowest ebb. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I hadn't been dreaming. The next morning, I called the telecommunications company that owned the tower to report possible unauthorized access. The technician I spoke with was polite but skeptical, asking whether I had seen any vehicles or equipment that might indicate a service crew. When I tried to describe what I had actually witnessed, he grew quiet, then suggested I might want to contact the local police if I was concerned about trespassing. I thanked him and hung up, realizing how my story must have sounded to someone who hadn't been there. I drove out to the tower the following evening, parking my car at the base and walking around the perimeter. The ground was hard-packed earth and scattered gravel, not the kind of surface that would hold clear footprints. But I searched anyway for any sign of the creature's presence. I found nothing unusual, no disturbed soil, no shed scales or strange residue, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. The tower stood exactly as it always had, a utilitarian structure of steel and cables reaching toward the sky. Over the next few weeks, I made a point of watching the tower during my shifts, but I saw nothing unusual. The red lights blinked, the equipment hummed its electronic songs, and the structure remained empty of anything except its intended purpose. I began to think that perhaps I had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue or the peculiar isolation of working nights in an industrial facility. But then, almost 2 months later, I saw it again. This time, I was ready. I had purchased a small video camera and kept it with me during my shifts, hoping to document whatever I might see. The creature appeared around midnight, emerging from the darkness as before and beginning its slow ascent of the tower. I filmed what I could, though the distance and lighting conditions made it difficult to capture clear images. When I reviewed the footage later, I could see something moving on the tower, but it was indistinct, ambiguous, the kind of thing that could be explained away as shadows or equipment malfunction. I saw it 5 more times over the course of that year, always following the same pattern, appearing after midnight, climbing to the top, remaining there for an extended period, then descending and disappearing into the darkness. Each time, I tried to document what I was seeing, but the evidence was always frustratingly inconclusive. Photos were blurry, videos were dark and grainy, and my written descriptions sounded increasingly fantastic even to me. I began researching similar sightings online, searching through forums and databases for any reports of large climbing creatures near telecommunications infrastructure. I found plenty of stories about strange animals in unusual places, but nothing that matched what I was witnessing. I considered contacting cryptozoology researchers, but I was reluctant to expose myself to ridicule or to invite unwanted attention to my workplace. The sightings stopped abruptly in late autumn. I continued to watch the tower through the winter and into the following spring, but the creature never returned. I was transferred to day shift that summer, and though I occasionally drove past the tower on my way to work, I never saw anything unusual during daylight hours. The structure looked ordinary, functional, unremarkable in every way. I retired from the water treatment plant 2 years ago, but I still think about what I saw climbing that tower. I've developed theories over the years. Perhaps it was some kind of unknown species drawn to the electromagnetic fields generated by the cellular equipment. Or maybe it was something that exists in the spaces between our normal perceptions, visible only under certain conditions of light and shadow and solitude. I've even considered the possibility that it was never there at all, that it was some kind of projection of my own mind, a symbol of something I needed to see but couldn't name. What I know for certain is that for 1 year, during the quiet hours of the night shift, I shared the darkness with something that didn't belong to the world as I understood it. It wasn't malevolent or threatening, it was simply other, following its own mysterious purposes in the spaces we've filled with our towers and signals and electric lights. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night and I see the red lights of a cell tower blinking in the distance, I find myself slowing down, scanning the metal framework for any sign of movement, wondering if somewhere out there, in the vast network of towers that connects our modern world, something is still climbing toward the stars, patient and purposeful and utterly alone. I was driving back from my sister's funeral in Ohio when I found the hotel. It was late October, and I'd been on the road for nearly 8 hours, pushing through that numb exhaustion that comes after difficult days. The service had been small, just family, and I'd left immediately afterward, unable to bear the weight of casseroles and condolences. I needed to be moving, needed the highway and the radio and the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. But by the time I crossed into Pennsylvania, the grief was catching up with me, settling into my chest like a stone. I knew I couldn't make it home to Baltimore in one piece. The exit came up suddenly, marked only by a small green sign that read, Millbrook, 2 miles. I'd never heard of Millbrook, but I needed coffee and a place to rest, so I took the ramp and followed a narrow 2-lane road through farmland and scattered trees. The town, when I reached it, was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 8 or 10 blocks of old houses and a few storefronts, the kind of place that probably looked exactly the same in 1950 as it did that October evening. Main Street was empty except for a few parked cars and the warm glow of windows against the early darkness. I drove slowly through the center of town, looking for a motel, or at least a diner where I could ask about accommodations. Most of the businesses appeared closed, their windows dark, but I could see lights in the houses, the blue flicker of television screens, and the softer yellow of lamps. It felt like a place where people went to bed early and rose with the sun, where the pace of life still followed older rhythms. I was about to turn around and head back to the highway when I saw it. The Millbrook Inn stood at the corner of Main and what might have been Oak Street, though I never got a clear look at the street sign. It was a 3-story building with white clapboard siding and dark green shutters, the kind of structure that suggested it had been built in the 1920s or 1930s. A simple wooden sign hung from a post near the front door, painted in elegant script that seemed to catch the streetlight perfectly. The building looked well maintained but not restored, as if it had been cared for continuously over the decades without ever being modernized or updated. I parked in the small lot beside the building and sat in my car for a moment, studying the place. Warm light spilled from the windows of what I assumed was the lobby, and I could see the shapes of furniture inside, chairs and small tables, the kind of sitting area where travelers might read newspapers or write letters. The whole scene had a timeless quality, like a photograph from a magazine about small town America. I grabbed my overnight bag from the trunk and walked to the front door. The lobby was exactly what I'd expected. Hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, oriental rugs that had faded to mellow blues and golds, and furniture that looked comfortable rather than stylish. The air smelled of old wood and something else, something clean and indefinable that reminded me of my grandmother's house. A man who appeared to be in his 60s stood behind the front desk, wearing a cardigan sweater over a white shirt. He looked up as I entered, and his smile was genuine, but not overly enthusiastic. "Good evening," he said. "Looking for a room?" "Yes, please, just for the night." I approached the desk, noting the old-fashioned guest register lying open beside a fountain pen. No computer terminal, no credit card reader, just a leather-bound book with lined pages. "We have a lovely room on the second floor," he said, turning the register toward me. "Quiet. Faces the back garden. Rate is $60. I signed my name and address in the book, my handwriting looking strange among the other entries. The man, I never learned his name, handed me a real key attached to a brass tag marked 7. The weight of it felt good in my palm, solid and reassuring. "Breakfast is served from 7 to 9 in the dining room," he said, gesturing toward an archway that led to what I could see was a small restaurant area. "Continental style, but we do have fresh eggs if you prefer something cooked." I thanked him and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was carpeted in deep red, with wallpaper that featured small flowers, in a pattern that might have been there for 40 years. My room was at the end of the hall, and when I unlocked the door, I found exactly what I'd hoped for: a clean, simple space with a double bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto a garden where I could see the silhouettes of trees and shrubs in the darkness. The bathroom was small but spotless, with white subway tiles and fixtures that appeared to be original to the building. I took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the road dust and some of the weight of the day. When I emerged, I felt more human than I had in hours. I put on clean clothes and went downstairs to the dining room. The space was intimate, with perhaps 8 tables covered in white cloths. Only one other table was occupied by an elderly woman who was reading a paperback novel while she ate what looked like chicken and vegetables. She glanced up and nodded politely when I entered, then returned to her book. I took a table near the window and ordered soup and a sandwich from a waitress who seemed to be about my age, maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The food was excellent: homemade soup that tasted like it had been simmering all day, and a sandwich made with thick slices of bread and what I was certain was turkey that had never seen the inside of a package. I ate slowly, watching the few people who passed by on the sidewalk outside. The pace of everything felt deliberately unhurried, as if the hotel existed in a pocket of time that moved differently from the rest of the world. After dinner, I returned to my room and tried to call my ex-wife to let her know I was safe. She'd been worried about me driving alone so soon after the funeral, and I'd promised to check in, but my phone showed no signal, not even one bar. I tried moving to different parts of the room, even opening the window, but nothing worked. It wasn't particularly surprising. Small towns often had dead zones, but it was mildly frustrating. I made a mental note to call her in the morning from the lobby. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The bed was comfortable, the room was perfectly quiet, and something about the whole place felt safe and removed from the complications of regular life. I woke naturally around 7:30, feeling more rested than I had any right to expect. I dressed and went downstairs for breakfast, where the same man from the night before was now arranging pastries on a sideboard. "Sleep well?" he asked, and I told him I had. The breakfast was as good as dinner had been: fresh fruit, real coffee, and eggs that were clearly from actual chickens rather than a factory somewhere. I took my time eating, reluctant to leave this pocket of calm and return to the highway. When I finally checked out, I asked the man for a business card or brochure, something I could use to recommend the place to friends. He smiled apologetically and said they didn't have any printed materials, that most of their guests found them by word of mouth or by chance, as I had. I thanked him for that excellent service and walked to my car, already planning to stop here again on future trips through Pennsylvania. The drive home took me through some of the prettiest countryside I'd seen in years, and I arrived in Baltimore feeling better than I had since before my sister's illness began. Over the next few days, I told several people about the Millbrook Inn, describing it as a hidden gem that was worth seeking out. A colleague who traveled frequently through that area asked for more specific directions, and I realized I couldn't remember the exact exit number or even the name of the highway I'd been on. I went online and searched for Millbrook Inn, Pennsylvania, and found nothing. I tried Millbrook, PA Hotel and got results for bed and breakfasts in other states, but nothing that matched what I'd experienced. I called directory assistance, thinking perhaps the hotel was too small to have a web presence, but they had no listing for any hotel in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. In fact, they had no listing for Millbrook at all. I dug out the atlas I kept in my car and studied the map of Pennsylvania, looking for any town named Millbrook along the route I'd taken. I found several small towns, but none with that name. I traced my route backward from Baltimore, trying to remember exactly where I'd stopped for gas, what landmarks I'd passed, but the details seemed to slip away from me like water through my fingers. I knew I'd driven through farmland. I remembered the narrow road and the quiet main street, but I couldn't place it geographically. 2 months later, I had to make another trip to Ohio, and I deliberately took the same route, watching carefully for the exit to Millbrook. I drove more slowly this time, studying every sign, every turnoff, but I saw nothing familiar. I stopped at several exits, driving through small towns that seemed similar but wrong somehow, too new, too busy, lacking the particular quality of timelessness that had made the Millbrook Inn so memorable. I've made that drive 6 times since then, always with the hope of finding the place again. I've varied my route, taken different highways, stopped at visitor centers to ask about small towns I might have missed. I've searched online databases of historic hotels, looked through tourism websites, even contacted the Pennsylvania Department of Tourism. No one has ever heard of Millbrook or the Millbrook Inn. The strange thing is, I still have the key. I discovered it in my jacket pocket a week after the trip, the brass tag still bearing the number 7. I should have returned it, of course, but I'd already been unable to locate the hotel. The key sits on my desk now, next to my computer, and sometimes I pick it up and run my thumb over the smooth metal, remembering the weight of it in my hand that night. I've considered the possibility that I dreamed the whole thing, that exhaustion and grief combined to create a vivid hallucination, but the key is real, solid, undeniably present. And I remember too many details: the pattern of the wallpaper in the hallway, the taste of the soup, the way the man's sweater had a small hole near the left elbow. Dreams don't usually contain such mundane, specific elements. What troubles me most is not that I can't find the hotel again, but that I can't find any trace that it ever existed. No records, no reviews, no mentions in local newspapers or historical societies. It's as if the place existed for one night only, materialized just long enough to provide exactly what I needed: a quiet refuge where I could rest and begin to heal, before disappearing back into whatever space between spaces it came from. I don't talk about this much anymore. People get uncomfortable when you tell them about experiences that can't be explained or verified. But sometimes, when I'm driving through unfamiliar territory late at night, I find myself scanning the roadside for small green signs, for narrow roads that might lead to quiet towns where time moves differently. And I keep the key because it's proof that something happened, even if I can't prove what it was, or where it was, or why I was allowed to find it when I needed it most. I learned Morse code from my grandfather when I was 12, sitting in his cramped basement workshop while he fine-tuned the ancient Hallicrafters receiver he'd bought second-hand in 1962. The rhythm of dots and dashes became as familiar to me as breathing, and by the time I got my amateur radio license at 16, I could copy 20 words per minute without thinking about it. There's something pure about communicating in code, something that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only the essential message moving through the air at the speed of light. For 23 years, I operated stations in the KC-WRS from the spare bedroom of my house in Wisconsin, sending and receiving signals to other operators around the world. I worked mostly on 20 meters during the day and 40 meters at night, when the ionosphere would carry my 5-watt signal thousands of miles to places I'd never seen. I kept detailed logs of every contact, noting call signs and locations and signal reports, building a careful record of conversations that lasted only minutes but connected me to people I would never meet. My specialty was what we called weak signal work, making contacts with stations that were barely audible above the background noise, pulling coherent messages out of static and interference through patience and careful listening. I had a particular talent for copying partial signals, filling in the gaps that atmospheric disturbance created in the transmission. Other operators would send me their difficult intercepts, asking me to decode messages that had been corrupted during their journey through the upper atmosphere. The signal that changed everything came on a Tuesday night in March, around 11:30. I was monitoring 14-70 URS, listening to a digital mode called PSK31 that painted scrolling text across my computer screen as operators around the world exchanged brief messages. The frequency was quiet except for a few European stations working each other across the Atlantic, their signals riding the nighttime propagation path that carried radio waves halfway around the world. Then I heard my own call sign. It was faint, almost buried in static, but unmistakably directed at me. KC9WRS to KC9WRS. The format was correct, my call sign being called by my call sign, but the syntax was wrong. You don't call yourself on the radio. It's like answering your own telephone, a technical impossibility that made no sense within the established protocols of amateur radio. I turned up the volume and fine-tuned the receiver, thinking perhaps I had misheard the transmission. But there it was again, clearer this time. KC9WRS to KC9RS QSL. The last part was a request for acknowledgement, asking if I was receiving the signal. I sat staring at the radio for a long moment, trying to understand what I was hearing. Someone was using my call sign to contact me, which was not only against regulations, but practically impossible unless they were transmitting from my own station. I keyed the microphone and responded, "This is KC9WRS. You are using my call sign. Please identify yourself properly." I released the transmit key and waited, listening to the soft hiss of background noise while I tried to think of a rational explanation for what was happening. The response came immediately. KC9WRS day KC9WRS. This is your transmission from October 15th at 23:47 UTC. Message follows. The weather here is clear and cold. Temperature 32 degrees. Light snow expected tomorrow. QRT. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. October 15th was 5 months away, and the message, I knew it word for word because I had transmitted those exact sentences during a routine weather report to a station in Minnesota 3 weeks earlier. But now, somehow, my own transmission was being played back to me by someone claiming to be me, dated in the future. I checked my logbook to be certain. March 8th, 23:20 UTC, I had indeed sent that weather report to WB9XYZ in Duluth. The words were identical, down to the specific temperature and the mention of expected snow. But according to the signal I was receiving, this transmission was somehow being sent from October 15th of the same year. I tried to respond, but the signal had faded, leaving only the normal background noise of the 20-meter band. I stayed at the radio for another 2 hours, listening and calling, but heard nothing more. I made a careful entry in my logbook, noting the impossible contact and the exact frequencies and times involved. Over the next several days, I researched every possible explanation I could think of. Radio waves can travel unusual paths under certain atmospheric conditions, bouncing off layers of the ionosphere in ways that extend their range far beyond normal limits. Occasionally, signals can even be reflected off the moon or artificial satellites, creating delayed echoes that return to Earth minutes or hours after transmission. But nothing I found could account for a signal being received 5 months before it was supposedly sent, or for the apparent editing of its content. The transmissions continued sporadically over the following weeks, always late at night, always using my call sign to contact me. Each time, I would hear portions of my own previous communications played back to me, but with subtle modifications. A weather report I had sent to California was repeated with a different temperature. A technical discussion I had conducted with a station in Germany came back with one word changed. A casual conversation about my day job was returned with my workplace, altered from school to hospital. The changes were small but significant, as if someone or something was testing my attention to detail, seeing if I would notice the discrepancies. I began keeping separate logs of the modified transmissions, documenting every variation from the original messages. The pattern was consistent, my own words, spoken in my own voice, but subtly wrong in ways that made me question my memory of the original conversations. I tried to engage with whoever was sending these signals, asking direct questions about their identity and location, but the responses, when they came, were always more of my own transmissions played back with minor edits. It was like talking to an echo that had learned to change its message slightly before returning to me. In May, I received the most disturbing transmission yet. It was a conversation I had never had, supposedly sent by me to a station I had never contacted. The voice was mine, unmistakably, but the words were unfamiliar. KC9WRS to KC9WRS. I understand now what's happening. The signals don't travel through space, they travel through time. Every transmission we send is also received somewhere else, someone else, QRT. I played the recording back dozens of times, analyzing every syllable. The rhythm of the Morse code was identical to my own sending style, the particular spacing and timing that every operator develops like a fingerprint. But I had no memory of ever transmitting those words, and the implications of the message sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. 23 years of late night radio operation, of sitting alone in the dark, listening to voices from around the world, might have taken a toll I hadn't recognized. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and the isolation of amateur radio can foster delusions of connection with people who might not even exist. But the recordings were real, captured on my digital interface and stored on my computer's hard drive. In June, I decided to conduct an experiment. I transmitted a specific message at exactly midnight UTC, something distinctive that I had never said before. This is KC9WRS testing temporal propagation. If anyone receives this transmission in the past or future, please respond with your location in time. I repeated the message several times and then settled back to wait. 3 hours later, I received my own transmission back. This is KC9WRS testing temporal propagation. If anyone receives this transmission in the past or future, please respond with your location in time. Response on October 15th, 2023. The experiment worked. The date was 4 months in the future from when I sent the original message, and there was no way I could have transmitted the response because I had been listening continuously since the original transmission. Yet there it was, my own voice answering my own question with information I couldn't possibly have had. I stopped transmitting after that. I continued to monitor the frequencies, listening for any further evidence of temporal propagation or edited signals, but I no longer keyed the microphone. If my transmissions were somehow traveling through time and returning changed, I didn't want to risk sending any more messages that might come back to haunt me. The last transmission came in September, just as I was beginning to think the phenomenon had ended. It was the longest message yet and the most coherent. KCNWRES to KCNWRES. This is your final transmission from December 31st, 1999. I want you to know that every signal we send changes things, creates ripples in time that we can't predict or control. The person editing your messages is you, 10 years in the future, trying to warn yourself about what's coming. Stop transmitting. Disconnect the antenna. Some conversations are too dangerous to have. 73. I looked up the date in my logbook. December 31st, 1999 was indeed my final transmission, for I went silent for several years, dealing with a family crisis that had required all my attention. The operator's sign-off, 73, was correct, and the warning about future consequences felt genuine in a way I couldn't explain. I disconnected my antenna that night and put the radio equipment in storage. I told myself it was temporary, that I would return to the hobby once I had time to research what had been happening and understand the implications. But the boxes remained sealed, and my amateur radio license eventually expired from disuse. It's been 15 years since I last transmitted, but I still have the recordings of those impossible signals. I've had them analyzed by audio experts who confirm that the voice patterns match my own speech characteristics, but who can offer no explanation for how conversations I never had could have been recorded in my own voice. The technical parameters are all correct: frequency, modulation, signal strength, but the temporal displacement remains inexplicable. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should set up the radio again, just to listen. But I remember the warning that claimed to come from my future self, and I think about the responsibilities that come with every transmission. If our signals really do travel through time as well as space, if every message we send creates changes we can't foresee, then perhaps some frequencies are better left silent. And sometimes I wonder about the operator who edited my messages, the future version of myself who tried to warn me about the dangers of temporal communication. Did he succeed in changing the timeline, or are we still caught in a loop of messages and responses that echo backward and forward through years we haven't lived yet? I suppose I'll find out on October 15th, when the calendar catches up to the date that appeared so often in my impossible logbook entries. Until then, I keep my radio silent and my antennas disconnected, listening instead to the ordinary sounds of the present moment, trying not to think too much about the voices that might be calling my name from frequencies I can no longer bear to monitor. I discovered it while scrolling through my photos on a Sunday morning, looking for a picture I'd taken of my niece's birthday cake the day before. The photo appeared between two images I remembered clearly, one of the cake with its 7 candles, another of my sister laughing as she helped blow them out. But there, nestled chronologically between those familiar moments, was a photograph I had never taken, which showed me sleeping. The image was taken from the foot of my bed, looking down at my sleeping form. I was lying on my side, one arm tucked under the pillow, my face peaceful in the way it only is during deep sleep. The lighting was soft, natural, as if taken during the early morning hours, when dawn light first begins to filter through bedroom curtains. The angle was slightly elevated, as if the photographer had been standing on something or holding the camera above their head. What disturbed me most wasn't just that someone had apparently entered my bedroom and photographed me without my knowledge, but that the image was stored in my phone's camera roll with a timestamp from 4:17 a.m. that very morning. According to the metadata, I had taken this picture myself using my own phone while I was unconscious. I live alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building in downtown Portland. The front door has two deadbolts and a chain, and I'm meticulous about locking them every night before bed. The fire escape outside my bedroom window is accessible, but the window itself has been painted shut for years, and I would have heard anyone trying to force it open. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been in my apartment except me. I examined the photo more carefully, zooming in on details that might provide clues about how it had been taken. My bedroom was exactly as I remembered leaving it. Clothes draped over the chair in the corner, books stacked on the nightstand, the water glass I always kept within reach sitting in its usual spot. Nothing appeared to have been moved or disturbed. Even my phone, which should have been charging on the nightstand where I always left it, was visible in the image, plugged into the wall exactly where I expected it to be. But if my phone was on the nightstand charging, how could it have simultaneously been used to take a photograph from the foot of the bed? I checked the other photos in my camera roll, looking for any evidence of sleepwalking or unconscious activity, but the images before and after the mysterious bedroom shot were all normal. Pictures from my niece's party, a sunset I'd photographed on my evening walk, a recipe I'd captured from a cookbook. There was no sequence of bizarre middle-of-the-night photography, no other images that I couldn't remember taking. I called my sister, thinking perhaps I had mentioned sleepwalking or strange dreams during the birthday party, but she said I had seemed perfectly normal, tired perhaps, but coherent and present throughout the evening. When I described the photograph, trying to make it sound less alarming than it felt, she suggested I might have taken it accidentally, maybe while fumbling for my phone during the night. But I knew that explanation didn't make sense. The photo was too well composed, too deliberately framed to be an accident. Someone had stood at the foot of my bed, positioned the camera carefully, and taken a clear, focused image of me sleeping. The question was whether that someone had been me, acting in some unconscious state I couldn't remember, or whether it had been someone else entirely. I installed a motion-activated camera in my bedroom that night, positioning it to cover the area around my bed. If I was sleepwalking or engaging in activities I couldn't remember, I would have evidence. If someone else was entering my apartment, I would catch them in the act. I went to bed feeling somewhat reassured, though I found it difficult to fall asleep, knowing that I was being recorded. The next morning, I checked the camera footage eagerly. The recording showed me going to bed at my usual time, lying in the same position I'd seen in the mysterious photograph. But around 4:15 a.m., something strange happened. The camera's view suddenly shifted, as if it had been moved or turned, and for several minutes it recorded only the ceiling. When the view returned to normal, I was still sleeping peacefully, and my phone was still charging on the nightstand. But when I checked my camera roll, there was another photograph. This one showed me from a different angle, taken from the side of the bed, capturing my profile against the pillow. The timestamp read 4:16 a.m., during the exact period when my security camera had mysteriously pointed toward the ceiling. I reviewed the security footage frame by frame, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance during the time the camera had been redirected, but there was nothing. No shadows crossing the lens, no indication that anyone had physically moved the device. It simply pointed upward for exactly 4 minutes, then returned to its original position, as if it had been programmed to look away during a specific window of time. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon continued with disturbing regularity. Every few nights, I would wake to find a new photograph of myself sleeping, each taken from a different position around my bed. The security camera would invariably malfunction during the exact moments when these pictures were being taken, always looking away or shutting off completely before resuming normal operation. I tried multiple cameras, different brands and models, even professional grade security equipment borrowed from a friend who worked in private investigation. But every device I installed would experience the same mysterious malfunction, creating gaps in the recording that corresponded precisely with the appearance of new photographs in my camera roll. The pictures themselves became increasingly unsettling. While the first few had been taken from obvious positions around the bed, later images seemed to come from impossible angles, directly above me, as if taken from the ceiling or from beneath the bed looking upward. Some showed extreme close-ups of my face, so detailed I could see individual eyelashes, while others captured wide shots that included parts of the room that should have been outside the frame based on the apparent camera position. I consulted a sleep specialist, hoping to determine if I might be experiencing some form of parasomnia that could explain the nocturnal photography. The doctor conducted tests, monitored my sleep patterns, and reviewed my medical history, but found nothing unusual. My sleep cycles were normal. I showed no signs of sleepwalking or other unconscious behaviors, and I had no history of psychological conditions that might cause dissociative episodes. The doctor did note one curious finding. During the nights when the mysterious photographs appeared, my sleep was unusually deep and undisturbed. The brain waves recorded during those periods showed a level of rest that was almost unnaturally profound, as if something was ensuring that I would not wake up during the photography sessions. I began staying with friends and family members, thinking that changing locations might break whatever pattern was causing the phenomenon. But the photographs followed me wherever I went. A picture of me sleeping on my sister's couch, taken from her coffee table. An image of me in my parents' guest room, shot from the doorway. Even a photograph of me napping in my car during a lunch break, captured from outside the passenger window. Each image appeared in my phone's camera roll with perfect clarity and appropriate timestamps, and each was accompanied by the same mysterious failure of any recording equipment I had set up to monitor my surroundings. Whatever was taking these pictures had developed an uncanny ability to avoid detection while documenting my most vulnerable moments. I started keeping my phone in a locked drawer before going to sleep, then progressed to leaving it in my car, then eventually storing it in a safe deposit box at the bank. But the photographs continued to appear, somehow transferred to my device, despite its physical absence from my sleeping area. The images now came with no metadata, no timestamp, no digital fingerprint that might explain how they had been captured or transmitted. The most disturbing discovery came when I decided to have the photographs analyzed by a digital forensics expert. She examined the images for signs of manipulation, looked for evidence of compositing or artificial generation, and analyzed every pixel for anomalies that might explain their origin. Her findings were both reassuring and terrifying. The photographs were completely authentic, showing no signs of digital manipulation or artificial creation. But according to her analysis, they hadn't been taken with my phone or any conventional camera. The image quality, compression artifacts, and digital signatures were unlike anything in her extensive database of camera and phone models. It's as if these pictures were created by something that understands photography perfectly, but doesn't use the same technology we do, she told me. The images are real, but they weren't captured by any device I can identify. I stopped trying to solve the mystery after that. The photographs continue to appear, roughly once or twice a week, showing me in various states of sleep across different locations and circumstances. I've learned to live with the knowledge that something, whether it's a part of my own unconscious mind or some external presence I can't comprehend, is documenting my rest with meticulous care and inexplicable method. The images have become a strange comfort in their consistency. They're never threatening or invasive beyond the basic violation of being photographed without consent. Instead, they seem almost protective, as if whatever is taking them wants to preserve moments of peace and vulnerability that I would otherwise never see. Sometimes I look through the collection, scrolling through months of sleep-in photographs, like a bizarre family album. In them, I see myself at my most unguarded, free from the tensions and anxieties that mark my waking hours. The person in those pictures looks more peaceful than I feel most days, and I've begun to wonder if the photographs are less about surveillance than they are about showing me something I need to see about myself. I keep my phone on the nightstand now, accepting whatever process is responsible for these images. And sometimes, in the moments just before sleep, I wonder who will be watching through the lens tonight, and what they see in my sleeping face that compels them to preserve it forever, in pixels I'll discover come morning. I was sitting on the dock at my uncle's cabin when I first heard the humming. It was late June, that perfect time of year when the northern Minnesota lakes are warm enough for swimming, but the mosquitoes haven't yet reached their summer fury. I'd come up for a week of solitude after my divorce was finalized, needing the kind of silence that only comes from being completely alone in a place where your cell phone has no signal and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away through dense forest. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of Loon Lake, a body of water so remote that it doesn't appear on most maps. My uncle built the place in the 1970s, back when you could still buy undeveloped lakefront for the price of a decent used car. It's a simple structure, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with windows that face west toward the water. The dock extends maybe 20 feet into the lake, ending where the sandy bottom drops off into the kind of deep, dark water that seems to hold secrets. I'd been there for 3 days, falling into the rhythm of lake life. Coffee at sunrise, reading in the afternoon, simple dinners cooked on the propane stove while watching the sun set behind the trees on the far shore. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a beaver somewhere in the distance. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to remember who I was when stripped of all the complications that had accumulated over 15 years of marriage. The humming started around 9 in the evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky. I was sitting on the end of the dock with a cup of tea, watching the first stars appear in the clear northern sky, when I became aware of a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low, barely audible, like the distant drone of a large engine or the resonance of a tuning fork struck far away. But there was something musical about it, a quality that suggested intention rather than mechanical accident. At first, I thought it might be a boat somewhere on the lake, though I hadn't seen any other vessels during my 3 days there. The sound was too steady and too pure to be an outboard motor, but lakes can carry sounds in strange ways, and distance can transform the familiar into the mysterious. I stood up and scanned the water, looking for navigation lights or the wake of a passing craft, but the lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror. The humming continued for perhaps 10 minutes, neither growing louder nor fading away, maintaining the same gentle intensity throughout. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, there was something soothing about it, like a lullaby hummed by a voice too distant to identify. But as I listened more carefully, I began to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the water at all. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw it then, suspended about 50 feet above the center of the lake. At first, it was just a shape against the stars, darker than the sky around it, roughly circular and perhaps 30 feet in diameter. It hung motionless in the air, defying every law of physics I understood, making no sound except for that low, musical humming that seemed to emanate from its very structure. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, certain that fatigue or stress was causing me to see things that weren't there. But the object remained, solid and undeniable, a presence that transformed the familiar lake into something alien and strange. It wasn't a balloon or a helicopter or any kind of aircraft I could identify. It simply existed in the space above the water, patient and silent except for that continuous, gentle song. The humming had a rhythm to it, I realized, a subtle pulse that might have been synchronized with my heartbeat, or might have been causing my heart to synchronize with it. See, I couldn't tell which. There was something hypnotic about the sound, something that made it difficult to look away from the floating object or to think clearly about what I was witnessing. I felt calm in a way that didn't match the strangeness of the situation, as if the humming was designed to soothe observers rather than alarm them. I sat back down on the dock, deciding that I would simply watch and wait to see what happened next. The rational part of my mind was insisting that I go inside, call someone, document what I was seeing, but a larger part of me was content to remain still and observe. The object wasn't threatening. It made no aggressive movements, emitted no harsh lights, showed no interest in me at all. It simply hovered above the lake, humming its quiet song to the night sky. As my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, I began to see more details. The object's surface seemed to ripple slightly, like water or liquid metal, and there were patterns visible on its underside, geometric shapes that might have been panels or seams or something else entirely. The humming grew more complex as I listened, revealing harmonies and overtones that suggested multiple voices or instruments working together in perfect synchronization. I lost track of time sitting there. The object remained motionless while the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of hours I barely noticed. The humming continued without variation, that same gentle, hypnotic tone that seemed to resonate not just in my ears but in my chest, my bones, the wooden planks of the dock beneath me. I felt more peaceful than I had in months, as if the sound was washing away the accumulated stress and sadness of the past year. Sometime after midnight, the object began to move, not quickly or dramatically, but with the same deliberate grace it had shown while hovering. It drifted slowly eastward, staying at the same height above the water, the humming gradually fading as it moved away from me. I watched until it disappeared beyond the tree line on the far shore, leaving only the familiar sounds of the night. Wind in the pines, the gentle lap of water against the dock, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the forest. I sat there for another hour, waiting to see if it would return, but the lake had returned to normal. The stars reflected peacefully on the dark water, and the only movement was the occasional ripple caused by a fish surfacing or a beaver swimming across the shallow bay near the cabin. Eventually, I went inside and tried to sleep, but my dreams were filled with that humming sound, as if it had taken up residence somewhere deep in my memory. The next morning, I walked around the lake, looking for any physical evidence of what I had witnessed. I found nothing, no disturbed vegetation, no unusual marks on the ground, no debris that might have fallen from the floating object. The lake and the surrounding forest appeared exactly as they had before, pristine and undisturbed. I began to wonder if I had dreamed the entire experience, if the isolation and emotional exhaustion of the divorce had caused me to hallucinate something that had never been there at all. But that evening, around the same time, I heard the humming again. I was inside the cabin, washing dinner dishes, when the sound drifted through the open windows. I stepped onto the porch and saw the object in the same position as the night before, hovering motionless above the center of the lake. This time, I was prepared. I tried to take photographs with my camera, but every image came out as nothing more than dark sky and water, as if the object was invisible to electronic sensors. I spent the rest of my week at the cabin, documenting the phenomenon as carefully as I could. The object appeared every night at almost exactly the same time, remaining in position for 2 to 3 hours before drifting away toward the east. The humming was always identical, that same low musical tone with its complex harmonies and subtle rhythms. I recorded it on my phone, but when I played back the audio, I heard only the normal sounds of a quiet evening by the lake. On my last night, I decided to try communicating with whatever was controlling the object. I brought a flashlight to the dock, and when the humming began, I flashed a simple pattern: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, Morse code for SOS, the universal distress signal. I repeated it several times, pointing the beam directly at the floating form above the water. For a moment, nothing changed. Then gradually, the humming shifted to a different tone, higher and more complex than before. The pattern of the sound seemed to mirror the rhythm of my flashlight signal: 3 short pulses, 3 longer ones, 3 short again. But where my signal had been desperate and crude, the response was elegant and musical, as if my simple message had been transformed into something beautiful. I tried other patterns: Long flashes, short bursts, random sequences, and each time the humming would shift to reflect what I had sent, interpreting my clumsy light signals as music and returning them as song. We continued this exchange for nearly an hour, and by the end, I felt like I had participated in a conversation conducted entirely in light and sound, meaning and emotion transcending the barrier of language. When the object finally drifted away that last night, the humming faded with a series of tones that sounded unmistakably like a farewell. I flashed my light 3 times in response and watched until the shape disappeared beyond the trees, leaving me alone with the sudden understanding that I had been changed by what I had witnessed. I returned to the city the next day, but I've never been able to forget those nights by the lake. I've researched every possible explanation: experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, mass hallucination, but nothing comes close to accounting for what I experienced. The object's behavior was too deliberate, too responsive, too purposeful to be explained by natural causes or human technology. I've been back to the lake several times since then, always hoping to see the humming object again. Sometimes I think I hear faint echoes of that musical tone carried on the wind, and once I could have sworn I saw a dark shape moving slowly across the stars. But I've never again witnessed anything as clear and undeniable as those 5 nights in June when something impossible floated above the water and sang to me in a language I didn't understand but somehow comprehended perfectly. I keep the experience to myself mostly. People would think I was crazy, or attention seeking, or suffering from some kind of delayed stress reaction to my divorce. But sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly isolated or disconnected from the world, I remember the gentle humming that seemed to resonate in harmony with my own heartbeat. And I know that somewhere above the dark water of a remote lake, there are things that exist beyond our understanding, patient and musical and utterly alien, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to those who need to know that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. I've lived in Oklahoma for 37 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather the plains could throw at you. Tornadoes that could level entire neighborhoods, hailstorms that turned summer afternoons into winter battlefields, and thunderheads so massive they looked like mountains of black marble reaching toward space. Growing up in Tornado Alley teaches you to read the sky the way sailors read the sea, to recognize the subtle signs that separate ordinary bad weather from the kind that makes the evening news. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened on the afternoon of August 15th, when the storm that came through our county violated every rule of meteorology I thought I understood. It started normally enough. I was working in my garden around 2 o'clock, pulling weeds from the tomato rows and checking the rain gauge that had been empty for 3 weeks. The drought had been brutal that summer, the kind that cracks earth into puzzle pieces and makes farmers stare at cloudless skies with expressions of quiet desperation. When I saw the first wisps of cumulus building on the western horizon, I felt the familiar hope that comes with any promise of moisture in a dry year. The clouds developed quickly, which wasn't unusual for August. By 2:30, they had darkened to the deep gray that usually means business, and I could see the telltale anvil shape forming at the top of the thunderhead. I gathered my tools and headed for the house, expecting a typical afternoon storm, maybe an inch of rain, some rumbling thunder, and the blessed relief of cooler air washing across the scorched landscape. But as I watched from my kitchen window, the storm began to behave in ways that made no sense. The clouds weren't moving from west to east, as they always did, carried by the prevailing winds across the Great Plains. Instead, they seemed to be rotating in place, spinning slowly like a vast pinwheel centered directly above our small town of Millbrook. The rotation was hypnotic, almost mechanical in its precision, as if the storm was being controlled by some invisible mechanism. The first drops of rain that hit my windows weren't water. They struck the glass with a sound like marbles being dropped, and when I looked more closely, I saw that each droplet was perfectly spherical, maintaining its shape instead of spreading across the surface as normal raindrops do. They rolled down the glass in straight lines, defying gravity in a way that made my eyes water just watching them. Then the real strangeness began. The rain started falling upward, not all of it, but perhaps one drop in every 5 or 6 would strike the ground and then rise back into the sky, moving with the same deliberate speed as the drops that were descending. It created a bizarre visual effect, as if the storm couldn't decide which direction was down. I stood at my window, watching droplets of impossible rain rise past the glass like tiny silver balloons, ascending toward clouds that continued their slow, mechanical rotation. The lightning came next, but it wasn't the jagged, chaotic discharge I'd seen in thousands of prairie storms. These bolts moved slowly, deliberately, tracing geometric patterns across the sky with the precisions of someone drawing with a fluorescent marker. Perfect triangles, exact squares, intricate spirals that hung in the air for seconds at a time before fading away. The thunder that followed each flash wasn't the sharp crack of normal lightning, but a low, musical tone that seemed to resonate in my chest. I tried to call my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, to see if she was witnessing the same impossible weather, but my phone produced only static, not the crackle of interference, but a smooth, even hiss that sounded almost like whispering. I turned on the radio, hoping for a weather report or emergency broadcast, but every station carried the same soft static, as if all the frequencies had been taken over by some signal I couldn't decode. The storm intensified, though intensified isn't really the right word for what happened. The rotation of the clouds became more pronounced, and the upward falling rain increased until roughly half of all precipitation was moving in the wrong direction. The geometric lightning began forming more complex patterns, interconnected shapes that looked almost like circuitry or writing in some angular script I didn't recognize. Around 3:15, the wind stopped completely. Not the gradual dying of a breeze, but an immediate, absolute stillness that felt unnatural in a way that made my skin crawl. The leaves on my oak tree, which had been rustling constantly in the hot afternoon air, became perfectly motionless. Even the upward falling rain continued its impossible ascent in the absence of any detectable air movement. That's when I saw the funnel. It descended from the center of the rotating cloud mass, but it wasn't like any tornado I'd ever seen. Instead of the familiar gray-black rope of debris and destruction, this was translucent, almost crystalline, and it moved with the same deliberate precision as everything else about this storm. It touched down in the field behind my house, but instead of tearing up earth and vegetation, it seemed to be depositing something, small, bright objects that scattered across the ground like seeds. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the area where the funnel had made contact. The objects it was leaving behind looked like drops of liquid metal, each one about the size of a marble, gleaming in the strange light that filtered through the rotating clouds. They weren't causing any damage to the grass or crops, just lying there on the surface of the field like silver coins thrown by some cosmic gambler. The funnel worked its way methodically across the landscape, visiting each field, each yard, each empty lot in our rural area. It never approached any buildings or caused any destruction, but everywhere it touched, it left behind those mysterious metallic droplets. The process took nearly an hour, and I watched the entire time, mesmerized by the purposeful way the phenomenon moved across our county. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm started to dissipate. The upward falling rain gradually ceased. The geometric lightning faded to normal jagged bolts, and the clouds began to move eastward in the conventional manner. By 5 o'clock, the sky had returned to its normal blue, and the only evidence of the impossible weather was the absence of wind and the strange metallic objects scattered across the landscape. I waited until the air was completely still before venturing outside to examine what the funnel had left behind. The objects were warm to the touch, with a surface that felt like smooth glass but looked like liquid mercury. They were heavier than they appeared, and each one was perfectly spherical, as if they had been manufactured rather than formed by natural processes. When I picked one up, it hummed softly, a sound so low I felt it more than heard it. I collected several of the objects, thinking I would take them to the university in the next county to have them analyzed. But when I checked on them the following morning, they had vanished, not broken or dissolved, but simply gone, leaving no trace on the cloth where I had placed them, except for small circular spots that were slightly warmer than the surrounding fabric. I drove around the county that day, talking to other residents about what they had experienced. Most people remembered a thunderstorm, but their descriptions varied wildly from what I had witnessed. Some recalled heavy rain and strong winds. Others mentioned unusual lightning, but no one else seemed to have seen the upward falling precipitation or the geometric patterns in the sky. When I described the translucent funnel and the metallic objects, people looked at me with the kind of polite concern usually reserved for someone who might be suffering from heat exhaustion. The local weather service had no record of any unusual activity in our area that day. Their radar data showed a typical summer thunderstorm that had dropped about half an inch of rain across the county. When I pressed the meteorologist about the possibility of anomalous conditions, he suggested that severe weather can sometimes create optical illusions that make normal phenomena appear extraordinary. But I know what I saw. I have detailed notes, written while the storm was still in progress, describing every impossible aspect of what occurred that afternoon. I've researched atmospheric physics, consulted with experts in meteorology and climatology, even contacted universities that study rare weather phenomena. No one has been able to explain how rain can fall upward, how lightning can form geometric patterns, or how a tornado can deposit objects instead of destroying them. I've never seen another storm like it, though I watch the western horizon carefully every time clouds begin to build. Part of me hopes to witness such a phenomenon again, to have another chance to document and understand what happened. But a larger part of me is content to have experienced something that exists beyond the boundaries of normal weather, something that suggests the atmosphere itself might be capable of behavior that our instruments can't measure and our theories can't predict. Sometimes, on perfectly clear days when the air is so still it seems to be holding its breath, I think I can feel the echo of that impossible storm. Not the memory of wind or rain, but the sense that the sky is watching, waiting, preparing for the next time it needs to demonstrate that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. And sometimes, in the field behind my house, where the translucent funnel touched down, I find small warm spots in the earth, circular patches where the grass grows slightly differently, and the soil feels electric to the touch. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract scientific attention, but enough to remind me that some storms don't just bring rain and wind, they bring questions that have no answers and leave behind evidence that vanishes before it can be properly examined. I keep watching the sky, not because I expect to see another impossible storm, but because I know now that the atmosphere holds secrets we haven't discovered yet, patterns of behavior that exist outside our understanding of how weather works. And somewhere above the plains, where I've lived my entire life, the air itself might be alive in ways we've never imagined, capable of creating phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about the boundary between the possible and the impossible. We were prepared for it. That's what I keep coming back to. How ready we thought we were. How we'd checked the astronomy websites and set our watches and driven 3 hours to find the perfect viewing spot. It was supposed to be a total solar eclipse, lasting 4 minutes and 17 seconds, visible across a narrow band that cut through our part of the state. Sarah had packed a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, and I'd brought the special viewing glasses I'd ordered online months in advance. We felt like we were part of something important, something rare and beautiful that we'd remember for the rest of our lives. The field where we stopped was about 10 miles outside of Clearwater, a little farming community that had suddenly found itself in the path of totality. We weren't the only ones who'd had the same idea. Maybe 30 or 40 cars were scattered across the meadow, families and couples, and amateur astronomers with telescopes and cameras. Everyone was in good spirits, that particular kind of excitement that comes from witnessing something cosmic and shared. Children ran between the cars while their parents set up folding chairs and checked their phones for the exact timing. The eclipse began right on schedule at 1:14 p.m. I remember looking at my watch and then up at the sun through the protective glasses, seeing the dark silhouette of the moon beginning its slow journey across the solar disk. Sarah took photos with her phone, though we both knew they wouldn't capture the real experience. There's something about standing under an open sky and watching celestial bodies perform their ancient dance that makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly connected to the universe. For the first hour, everything proceeded exactly as predicted. The moon crept steadily across the sun, and the light around us began to change in that subtle way that happens during eclipses, not dimmer exactly, but different, as if someone had adjusted the color temperature of the world. The shadows under the trees grew sharper, and the air felt cooler despite the summer heat. People around us began to quiet down, sensing the approach of totality. At 2:31 p.m., the moon completed its transit across the sun, and day became night. Not the gradual darkening of sunset, but an abrupt, startling darkness that felt both thrilling and somehow wrong. The temperature dropped maybe 10 degrees in the span of seconds, and we could see stars appearing in the sky around the eclipsed sun. Venus was particularly bright, hanging like a jewel in the false twilight. Sarah reached for my hand, and I could feel her trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the sheer strangeness of standing in noon darkness under a black sun surrounded by a crown of silver fire. The 4 minutes passed like a dream. People whispered and pointed, and someone's baby began to cry, confused by the sudden night. I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell, and then, according to my watch, it should have ended. The moon should have moved on, the sun should have blazed back to life, and the world should have returned to normal afternoon brightness, but it didn't. At first, we thought perhaps our watches were wrong, or that the prediction had been slightly off. These things aren't perfectly precise after all. We waited another minute, then 2, then 5. The darkness persisted, deep and strange, with that impossible ring of light hanging in the sky where the sun should have been. Around us, other people were beginning to murmur, checking their phones and their cameras, comparing notes about the timing. "Maybe it's longer than they predicted," Sarah said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. We both knew that eclipses were calculated centuries in advance, that the orbital mechanics were understood to the second. There was no maybe about it. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The darkness wasn't complete. We could still see each other, still make out the shapes of cars and people across the field, but it was deep enough that the automatic streetlights in distant Clearwater had begun to flicker on. Some of the families with young children started packing up their things, unsettled by the prolonged night, but most of us stayed, transfixed by the impossibility of what we were experiencing. I tried to call my brother, who lived about 50 miles south of the eclipse path, to ask what it looked like from his location, but my phone showed no signal, which was strange because I'd had full bars when we'd arrived. Sarah's phone was the same. No service, no data, as if the towers had simply stopped working. We weren't panicking yet, but there was a growing sense that something was very wrong. By the 30-minute mark, people were beginning to leave in earnest. Cars started their engines and pulled carefully out of the field, their headlights creating strange moving patterns in the unnatural dusk. But for every vehicle that left, it seemed like others were arriving. People from towns outside the eclipse path who had noticed the prolonged darkness and come to see what was happening. The situation was becoming surreal, almost carnival-like, with a constant stream of cars moving in and out of the field. Sarah and I stayed because we didn't know what else to do. We sat in our folding chairs, looking up at the impossible sky, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The eclipsed sun hung exactly where it should have been, that bright corona dancing around the dark circle of the moon, but time seemed to have stopped. My watch continued to tick forward, 3:15, 3:30, 4 Salker, but the sky remained locked in that moment of totality. Around 4:30, A woman with a telescope called out to the remaining crowd. She'd been tracking the positions of the visible stars and planets, and according to her observations, they were moving normally across the sky. Everything else in the heavens was following its expected path, everything except the sun and moon, which remained frozen in perfect alignment. It was as if someone had paused that one part of the cosmic machinery while allowing everything else to continue. As evening approached, real evening, not the artificial twilight of the eclipse, the darkness deepened further, but the corona was still there, still visible, a ring of silver light that shouldn't have been possible to see except during those few minutes of totality. We were witnessing something that violated every law of astronomy, and yet there it was, undeniable, hanging in the sky above us. We finally left around 7 p.m., when hunger and thirst and the need for a bathroom became more pressing than curiosity. The drive home was surreal. The highways were full of cars, all heading away from the eclipse zone, and every radio station was carrying news about the eclipse anomaly that was baffling scientists around the world. Emergency management officials were asking people to remain calm, to avoid the affected area if possible, and to report any unusual observations to local authorities. The next morning, I expected to wake up and find that everything had returned to normal, that the sun had finally emerged from behind the moon sometime during the night. But when I stepped outside with my coffee, the sky was still wrong. Not the deep twilight of eclipse darkness, but a strange, muted light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sun was visible, but it looked different, smaller, paler, as if seen through thick glass or smoke. The news reports that day were cautious and confused. Scientists from NASA and observatories around the world were studying the phenomenon, but no one had any explanations. The eclipse had ended in other parts of the country exactly as predicted, but in our region, an area roughly 50 miles in diameter, the sky remained altered. Satellite images showed a circular zone where the light was measurably different from the surrounding areas, as if we were living under some kind of filter that affected only us. In the weeks that followed, teams of researchers descended on our area, setting up instruments and conducting interviews. They measured everything they could think of: electromagnetic radiation, gravitational anomalies, atmospheric composition, but found nothing that should have caused what we were experiencing. The light remained strange, never quite reaching the full brightness of normal daylight, carrying a quality that made colors appear muted and shadows look deeper than they should. Most disturbing was the effect on plant life. Within a month, the leaves on deciduous trees had begun to turn color, as if autumn were arriving in July. Gardens and farm crops grew more slowly, and some flowering plants stopped blooming entirely. It wasn't killing the vegetation, but it was changing it, adapting it to this new kind of light that wasn't quite natural and wasn't quite artificial. People began to leave, not everyone, and not all at once, but steadily, quietly, families and businesses relocating to places where the sun still shone normally. Real estate values plummeted, and the few stores that remained open started keeping strange hours, as if no one could quite agree on when day ended and night began. The children seemed to adapt more easily than the adults, but even they would sometimes stop playing and stare up at the sky with expressions of confused concern. I stayed longer than most. Sarah left after 3 months, taking a job in Denver and asking me to come with her, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I felt responsible somehow, as if leaving would be an abandonment of something important. I'd been there when it happened. I'd witnessed the moment when the world changed, and walking away felt like giving up on finding answers. I finally moved to the next county over about a year later, but I still drive through the affected area sometimes, just to see if anything has changed. The zone is mostly empty now, with only a few holdouts remaining in the larger towns. The abandoned houses are already beginning to show signs of neglect, and weeds are growing through cracks in the sidewalks. But the light is still wrong, still carrying that quality of eternal eclipse, and the sky still looks like it's waiting for something to end. The scientists have mostly given up and moved on to other projects. The official reports classify it as an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, possibly related to unusual solar activity, and leave it at that. There are a few researchers who continue to study the area remotely, analyzing satellite data and publishing papers in obscure journals, but the general consensus seems to be that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I think about that day often, about the moment when we realized that the eclipse wasn't going to end. I remember the excitement we'd felt, the sense of witnessing something rare and wonderful, and how quickly that excitement had transformed into unease and then into something approaching fear. We'd come to see the universe perform one of its most beautiful tricks, and instead we discovered that sometimes the performance doesn't end when it's supposed to. That sometimes the cosmic machinery can get stuck in ways that we don't understand and can't fix. And I wonder sometimes if this is how the world ends, not with violence or catastrophe, but with subtle changes that accumulate slowly until the familiar becomes strange and the strange becomes normal. Maybe that's what we witnessed that day, not an eclipse at all, but the first sign that the old rules were changing, that the universe was shifting into a new configuration that we hadn't been taught to recognize.